Um, okay, so our recording has started, so everybody will be able to see this live streamed, and we'll get the recording out later after we're done. Let me put that away. Okay, so I'm going to start by talking about why we need social housing and what I do for House Our Neighbors, because that's what this panel is all about. What is social housing? So first off, I think what's really important about this initiative specifically, because we will talk about the difference between current nonprofit and governmental affordable housing programs and what we're planning to implement here in Seattle. But aside from the differences and benefits that we will go into, I think for me, the most important part about this initiative is that we build renter power. So some things about what we're doing will look maybe or sound similar to affordable housing or other models that that we're currently doing. But the biggest difference to me is renter power, renters being on the board of this PDA, renters having some control over how the building is built, if we build buildings, how it's operated, if it's acquired. So that is kind of the movement that we're looking at here. It isn't just about gathering signatures. It isn't just about getting this one initiative onto the ballot and passed. A lot of it is about educating renters on ways that we can take back some of that power and gaining that power in a movement around a specific policy. And so I think that because Black and Brown people are more likely to be renters than white folks, it is super important that while that is like the only option for a lot of poor and marginalized people, that we as renters actually like consolidate our power and we fight for something that's going to give us a little bit more autonomy in our housing situation as the housing affordability crisis worsens over time. So social housing is hopefully one thing in our toolkit as a city as we address the housing affordability crisis. And everybody here knows a lot about social housing, and they're going to talk about what they have to offer and what social housing can do for us. I'm going to introduce all of the panelists. And while I do that, Tiffany, who is my co-chair, has put some links into the chat for how you can get involved with House Our Neighbors as we attempt to gather 35,000 signatures by the end of June so that we can have initiative 135 on the November ballot. So the first person that we're going to hear from is Senator Stanley Chang. He is the chair of the oh gosh, I have all kinds of pop-ups. He's chair of the Hawaii State Senate's Committee on Housing since 2019. His proposal to end Hawaii's severe housing shortage is Aloha Homes, or affordable, locally owned homes for all, based on the Singapore model of social housing. Under the plan, the state would develop high-density condo units on state-owned lands near rail stations currently being built and sell 99-year leasehold interest to the unit at cost to Hawaiian residents who would be owner-occupants with no income restrictions. So we'll hear more from Senator Chang about what he's doing in Hawaii regarding social housing. Paul Williams is an economist and has also been advising House Our Neighbors Coalition and a public policy expert with a focus on developing public sector enterprises and social housing developers in particular. He is currently a fellow at the Jane Family Institute in New York. He previously served in the policy division of the Chicago Department of Housing. And before that, he worked on tax policy for the Economic Opportunity Institute in Seattle. Our final panelist will be Oksana Mironova, and she is a writer and researcher who was born in the former Soviet Union and grew up in Brooklyn. She writes about cities, urban planning, housing, and public space. You can follow her on Twitter at Oksana Mironova or read her work at oksana.nyc. So if that sounds good to everybody, I'm going to start with the first question, and I kind of want to pivot to Oksana as our resident researcher on this urban planning and housing, and just go into what even is social housing, just to ground ourselves in understanding and kind of agree on a definition going forward.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I'm super excited to be here, and I'm really supportive of the proposal that you all are working on and pitching and are organizing around. It's awesome to see work around social housing happening in all parts of the US. So my work in social housing happened within the organization that I currently work for, the Community Service Society of New York. And before talking about social housing, I just want to mention that I collaborated on this research with my coworker, Tom Waters, who sadly passed away in early 2020 because of COVID. So this work kind of comes out that started there. We published a paper in 2020 because there was kind of like lots of stuff happening at the time. This was like right before the pandemic started. There was a presidential election. There was a lot of work in New York happening around building the tenant movement and organizing around tenants' issues. And in 2019, we were fighting for the expansion of New York's rent stabilization system. We won, and rent stabilization became much stronger. Obviously, not like, like a total final victory. There's still lots of things that are missing, but that was kind of like a big win. And out of the conversations that we were having with tenant advocates and tenants living in the city, we started kind of like thinking about what to do next. Like, what is the step after focusing so much time on defending and kind of like fighting against the retrenchment of tenants' rights and like subsidized housing in the city and in the country as well. So one of the models that we started looking at was social housing in other parts of the world. So thinking about places in South America, thinking about Europe, thinking about parts of Asia, where housing affordability is defined in a very different way, and where housing is treated less as a commodity and more as a place where people live and kind of like as a public good. So we social housing in the US and for like broader space for it as well. And the three big kind of like buckets that we came to were decommodification, social equality, and democratic resident control. Now, this model was kind of like an ideal. So it's not like there's necessarily like perfect decommodification, perfect social equality, and perfect democratic control in, like, honestly, in like the places that we look toward either. So there's always tension around how much the market has influence over what happens in social housing, even in places that do it really well. There's always tension about resident control and about who actually has the power. And there's always tension around who is excluded from these models. So in terms of like kind of like making this a little bit more specific, there's affordable housing programs in the US that kind of like fill some of these buckets, but not necessarily all of them. So public housing is decommodified, but is experiencing immense pressure because it's been defunded continuously by the federal government. Nonprofit managed rentals have elements of decommodification and sometimes have elements of resident control, but similarly are obviously still very much influenced by the market. The kind of like the community land trust model has elements of both, all three of these things, so decommodification, social equality, and resident control, but is fairly new. So the like amount of resident control that happens is kind of like still in the works. So when I think about social housing, I like to think of it as like a continuum, basically, where what really matters is less the specific type of ownership structure, even though that's really important, but thinking about how well the model shields tenants who are living, tenants or owners, or however you want to describe the people who are living in the units, how well the housing shields them from market pressures, from things like, like the rise in inflation that's happening right now, from corporate buyers and corporate landlords who want to buy up the housing. Also how well it promotes racial and economic integration, and how much it allows for true resident governance. So not like tokenism, but like actual meaningful participation in the governance of the property and the land. Yeah, so I can stop there. Oh, and I should say that one thing that I really like about the housing our neighbors model is that you kind of like outline the 4 pillars of social housing and break up decommodification into public ownership and permanent affordability, which I think makes the kind of like the policy aspect of decommodification a bit easier to grasp because it's kind of like a nebulous word that could mean a lot of things. So yeah, I'll stop there, and I think we could get into it a little bit more about what each of those three buckets actually mean in practice.
Yeah, I think that I'm not as super familiar with those four tenets, and I feel like if I were quizzed, maybe I could come up with them. But to your point about comparing those different kinds of housing models that do exist, that kind of touch on maybe one or four of the things that you just talked about, yeah, to that point, I think Paul can talk about why we need social housing from the perspective of like where those models kind of fail and where housing, like getting into the details of why social housing can maybe can address the gaps in between and those different models that we have currently.
Sure, yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, I think there are numerous failures all over the board in the kind of current way that housing is produced in the United States. You know, I guess I'll just go through what some of those failures are and what social housing can do differently. And this is actually a question that I get a lot, you know, from people who, you know, sometimes people start to look at the details of social housing and say, well, what exactly is different about you know, things that a social housing developer or agency or whatever you want to do can do that we can't like fashion out of these other kind of pieces that we have today. And I think there's a number of them. You know, so for example, public housing that exists in the United States is a program that started in the 1930s as kind of, you know, originally the first couple of years, it was an experiment. And then it had a, you know, series of laws kind of attached to it that a number of researchers, you know, have kind of concluded over the years, kind of hobbled it in these certain ways that prevented it from being a little bit more of a broad-based kind of mass public housing program, which is what a lot of the union organizers who were fighting for it in the 30s really wanted. That created, didn't maybe create those conditions, but it kind of led to conditions where in the 1980s and 1990s, when we had this kind of welfare reform era, public housing was a really easy thing for a lot of politicians to look at and say, this program is just really expensive for me. And these, you know, they would have all of these stories about people who live in public housing who shouldn't live in public housing. And we got this massive, you know, defunding of public housing that happened. And now, you know, New York City Housing Authority is a really kind of prime example of what happens when you just turn off the funding tap. And now the backlog of repairs that NYCHA needs to make at its properties is over $40 billion now. And that's just been growing for the past 20 years. So that's obviously a huge problem. And then of course, you know, you have market housing, right? Which, you know, most people in the United States today live in market housing, right? Housing that's owned by a private entity. But, you know, and some people who live in market housing, you know, have incomes and they're able to afford the rents in that market housing. But people who are, you know, essentially below median income and low income can't afford those rents. And there's a lot of people who would never be able to afford those market rents, right? You know, people who are very low income, you know, below, I don't want to get too technical, 50% AMI maybe, right? Like these, you know, people who are making $40,000 a year or less, there have to be programs to help people who are very low income be able to afford housing. And there's nowhere in the world that you know, anybody's able to meet those people's needs without you know, big subsidized housing programs. I think for me, something that I really see as important that separates social housing and in particular public developers, which I think is a really important part of social housing for me, and something that I really like about the House Our Neighbors proposal, is that you have a public developer who's able to build these projects. is that recessions are this kind of something that we accept as a natural part of the economy, right? Recessions are just a thing that happen under capitalism, and everyone says, well, they happen and there's nothing we can really do about it. There's a really great study in Europe a number of years ago that looked at housing prices and housing costs, comparing two countries, Austria and Ireland, before the housing financial crisis, during the housing financial crisis, and after the housing financial crisis. Austria obviously is famous for having a huge amount of social housing. So the public sector both does a lot of its own development, funding housing and building housing itself, and also provides public financing for nonprofits and tenant organizations to develop and own housing. So the public sector is just massively involved in housing production. Whereas in Ireland, the social housing sector is much, much smaller. And you don't have that huge amount of kind of public investment in public building. And if you look at housing costs, comparing Austria to Ireland before, during, and after the housing financial crisis, Ireland just shoots up before the crisis and then plummets after the crisis and then shoots back up. Austria, costs just stay relatively flat for housing all across the housing financial crisis. And that's because the authors of the study essentially attribute that a large part of that to the fact that the public sector is essentially backing housing production. It's like, we don't need to have a recession for housing. I'm the public sector. I don't care about risk in the market, right? This is a public good that I need to produce, and I'm going to keep producing it. And I think that's a really important thing because, some of those factors are maybe, harder to, tie down how that's a direct impact on, my life personally at the very moment. But those are really big factors at play, right? Like when a recession happens in the United States and we don't have a public developer who's going to kind of pick up the slack, we just have massive unemployment, wage loss, construction workers out of work for half a decade, all of these kind of things. And that kind of recessionary economic volatility just isn't something that we have to accept. And I think that social housing is a way that the public sector and community groups can kind of say, we don't have to stop building housing when there's a recession. We can keep doing it because it's a public good that we need, and it has this broader stabilizing effect. I don't want to kind of been talking for a while, but that's a really big piece for me that I think is really important.
Yeah, thank you for that, Paul. I've got a request to talk slower on my end, so I'm going to try to do that.
Sure.
Just keep that in mind for everybody when you're going. I think you and Oksana probably sounded fine. You mentioned the phrase public good, and I know from Senator Chang's work, like that is your focus on why we need social housing, because housing should be like a public good. And Paul kind of touched on like the economic reason why social housing might be a good alternative. But, as an elected official who's fighting for it in your state, what's your reason for why states and the country as a whole needs social housing?
So I've been working on housing since 2018 here in Hawaii. And when I became chair of the housing committee here, I wanted to, so Hawaii has a very severe housing shortage. 3 of the 4 counties have median house prices over $1.1 million right now. And so I wanted to look at jurisdictions that had actually solved housing shortages. And there are a lot of good ideas that people have that make intuitive sense when it comes to housing. And a lot of these have gotten traction in places like Hawaii, ideas like inclusionary zoning and upzoning. But I wanted to see, again, what jurisdictions that actually had solved the problem looked like. And so, places like California have clearly not solved the problem. Well, there are places that have. And, 2 of them are Singapore and Vienna. And what they basically have is the government builds tons and tons of housing and doesn't stop and sells it to everyone who wants it with either no or very high income limits. So in Singapore, over 80% of the population lives in public housing. In Vienna, over 60% of the population lives in public housing. The president of Singapore lived in public housing until she was forced to move due to security concerns into the presidential palace. So it really got me thinking that, the only, Hawaii has such a severe housing shortage. If we want to create 65,000 units by 2025, which is what, one study shows, I think it actually needs to be more. But if you're building at tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of units, that's historically, you need a big governmental entity like the state or, the city of Vienna or the nation of Singapore to be just churning out like 20,000 units a year. You're not going to get to 100,000 units one at a time or a couple dozen at a time. That's what was really appealing to me. You could do the public sector route. There are examples of that. Houston is one example that people in America tend to be familiar with, but Houston has no zoning. So anyone can build anything, anywhere, anytime. And in a place like Hawaii, probably also in a place like Seattle, where people are super conscious of the importance of our agricultural lands, of our, habitats for our endangered indigenous species, Houston-style sprawl everywhere is just not politically realistic in Hawaii. So that's why we kind of end up at the government builds a lot of high-density housing. And it turns out that this model actually has a lot of historical American precedent. And so Paul, touched on some of this earlier. Back in the day, they used to say, a program for the poor is a poor program. And you really saw that progressives in Washington wanted to create universal programs. Public services are for the public. There are a number of them today that we take for granted: public highways, public parks, public schools. No one, no income restrictions whatsoever. They're open to everybody. In fact, if, Bill Gates or Jeff Bezos wanted to send their kid to the local public school and then to the University of Washington afterwards, how would we feel about that? We'd feel fantastic, even though we would be forced to pay for their education when their parents are clearly capable of paying for a private education for their kids. Now, why are we comfortable with that? It's because public services for the public. This is America. If the schools are good enough for the homeless families, they should be good enough for the billionaire families as well. And we are all equal here in America. That's basically what we're trying to create, and what I think Singapore and Vienna have successfully created is public school for housing, a mass option that people default to, that people take for granted. It doesn't have to be heavily subsidized. In Singapore, actually, if you look at the numbers closely, they actually make a profit off their housing, but they're able to offer it at a very low price, $180,000 for a 3-bedroom, 2-bath condo. And that way, if you make a program accessible to everybody, you get the political support so that you don't have this problem of what happened in the US in the 70s and 80s, where Republican administrations came in and slashed spending on public housing. And so it's available to everybody. So we have programs like that in America, like Social Security, Medicare, no income restrictions, and Democratic and Republican presidents alike have continued these programs because they are available to rich and poor alike. And in some ways, it's not that different from existing, LIHTC development, say. The chief differences would be that, number one, it would not require a heavy subsidy. And number two, it would actually seek to build enough to meet demand instead of always falling short. And in those two ways, we can create a whole new kind of social compact. If I were to sort of encapsulate the message of what I think the state of Hawaii should be delivering to our constituents, it should be one job should be enough. If you're working full-time, you should be able to have a good life. And we have a lot of those components already. You already have universal free public education. In Hawaii, we have 90-something% healthcare covered. The biggest missing piece in Hawaii, at least, is the cost of housing. And so if we're able to just build a large-scale mass option, low cost, where people can just be assured that there's a place to live, I think that really sort of completes the social compact where everybody is going to be able to have a good life here.
Thank you for that, Senator Chang. I think as I'm listening to you, I'm on board. I think a lot of folks would be, but there's one big question that always comes up when you talk about public goods and how people decide, which ones we want to take on and which ones we don't. So Paul, the biggest question that we always get is, well, how is this funded? And I think that Senator Chang has spoken to some international models like Vienna and Singapore. But we also know if you've encountered House Our Neighbors at any point in the last few weeks, we talk a lot about Montgomery County and Maryland too. So could you talk, a little bit to give people an idea of abroad and more locally, how would social housing be paid for, and what would that look like for the initiative that we're really discussing, 135?
Sure, yeah, that's a good question too. So, the way that, for example, low-income housing tax credit projects are built today is, and LIHTC that builds something like 90% of all of the subsidized housing in the United States today. It's the biggest producer of subsidized housing. There are many issues with the program that I could go into, but I'm not going to get into that tonight. But the way that it essentially works is, if you're building housing anywhere in the country, Singapore, Vienna, Finland, Latin America, United States, you're taking out a mortgage construction loan. And that is, even in the 1930s, there was, a lot of grant funding for public housing, but there was also a mortgage loan. And there's nobody that's really gotten around that. And when you're building a project, your kind of limit on how low can I make my rents is how much are my costs every month, right? I have to pay workers to work in the building. I have to pay my maintenance costs. I need to, I need to update the windows every 10 years. I need to replace the roof every 8 years, all of these different things. And I need to pay my loan back. And, you just have these costs that it costs to operate a building. And that's just, kind of in a scale, nobody's going to work on your building or work to build your building if they're not getting paid. So I think a way that I think about, conceptualize of what do we want to do when we have a public developer who can do these projects and provide us more subsidy, is we're lowering the total amount of debt costs that we're taking out, right? And that's actually what LIHTC, low-income housing tax credit, does. That's what we, the way that program works today is it puts this kind of equity investment from the federal government into the project, and it lowers the total debt cost, which allows the rents to be set lower. With social housing in a lot of other countries, for example, Finland and Singapore, those projects are essentially financed entirely by public banks. So the public banks offer loans to the housing development companies, right? So for example, in Finland, there's a municipal company called Heka that just gets these interest-free 60-year loans from the public bank. So its debt costs are very low. In Singapore, you have the national government gives these loans to the Housing Development Board, which builds its projects, and they're very cheap. In Montgomery County, they don't have a public bank. In fact, almost nowhere in the United States, other than North Dakota, interestingly, do we have any kind of public banks. So we don't have the benefit of that yet. That is very much something that in the midterm, maybe the 10-year term, I think public banks are a really important part of developing social housing more broadly. We need these public institutions that can do lending at low to no cost so that we can do these projects even bigger and make them even better. But Montgomery County doesn't have that. Almost nobody has that. What they devised is a pretty interesting method for issuing municipal bonds, getting some funding up front for themselves, and using that to put into their projects. So they also take out a loan just like anybody else does, but they put some of their municipal bond investment money into the project too. And then when the project gets built and it gets leased up and people start to move in, they kind of refinance the project, and they take that money they loaned to themselves and they put it back in their investment bucket. The very next day, that money can go out into another project they want to build, right? So they have kind of this revolving loan fund for themselves. This is somewhat similar to how it works in Singapore with that housing development board, where they kind of replace these loan funds to themselves. But obviously it's a little bit different because this is, for Montgomery County, it's a smaller portion of their total project cost. So I think that's a way to think about it. And there's a number of different ways that you can do this. Montgomery County has, kind of the public housing authority there has devised this really interesting way that they're doing it. And I think it's a good model. And I think really what it's doing is mimicking some aspects of public banks in other countries. And I really think that's the broader direction that we need to move in to finance these projects. Obviously, another thing that you can do is increase taxes a lot and get a lot of grant money and just plow it into housing production. Politically, that's a little bit harder to take on. As I've worked on some tax campaigns in Seattle in the past, about 6 years ago. So I mean, those things are great and important for reducing income inequality, and they can also be really helpful because if you have a public developer that can do these projects and get this mix of incomes essentially for free, right? It's paying these bonds back, but if it can get these mix of incomes, any dollar that you put on top of that you've raised for subsidies for extremely low income people, right? I mean, folks who are formerly homeless or experiencing substance abuse issues, who have people who have no income, even in Finland, for example, those folks they have housing benefits that they get from the government, right, that help them pay rent, that pay their rent for them essentially, right? So there's always people who are very low income, we're always going to need grant subsidies to help those people pay their rent. There's no way that we're not going to have that. And the nice thing about these public developers is that any grant funds that we get, we're already starting from a much higher place than we would otherwise, right? Because we have this nice income mix already. So that's a big picture way I think about it. I hope that's a helpful explanation.
Thank you, Paul. You forgot one other way we could pay for this. It's defund certain departments in the city council budget that seem overly bloated. I could think of at least one. So yeah, that's another path forward for us. So thank you for walking through the funding mechanism. I know it's not usually like the easiest to understand, especially for me, but I think it is super important, and it kind of does key into a few other things when I talk about renter power and building up like a movement. Working on a public bank, super important. I think that's another step that Seattle needs to take. I think Senator Chang and maybe Paul yourself talked about zoning being an issue. I think that's another thing that we're going to need to tackle, even if we get when we get the social housing public developer off the ground. So thinking about the different ways that aside from the kind of model that you talked about in Montgomery County, it's like it's never too late for us to fight for a public bank. So now that we've kind of talked a lot about the details of what social housing is, how it's funded, how it's different, how it's funded differently across the globe, and how it's different from affordable housing, Oksana, can you talk to me about what does this do for communities, right? That's kind of what I'm most concerned about is, once you're a family living in a social housing unit, or once a city is able to get some social housing units, how does it change communities for the better?
Yeah, so I think that there's kind of two, afford the people who did it as
hold on, Oksana. I think we're having some audio issues. Paul and Stanley, are you hearing her okay? It's a little
choppy. Yeah, maybe try without the headphones.
Can you all hear me better now?
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you. Sorry for interrupting. Please continue.
No, totally. Yeah, it was, I think my headphones were losing power. Yeah, no, so I was saying that there is kind of, when you introduce decommodified housing, whether we're calling it social housing, public housing, whatever it is on the continuum, into a place, there's two things that happen. One happens in the community level, the other one happens on kind of like the individual person level. On one hand, if you have in cities, high cost cities, whether we're talking about New York or Seattle or like Berlin, the instability that people have living in rental housing that doesn't have security of tenure, or people who are living in homeless shelters or sleeping in the street, is obviously like has awful outcomes. And like, I don't think there's like a ton of studies about how those things are bad, but I don't think that we need to explain why not having either a home at all or not having a single home is bad. Like, it's bad. So by introducing stability, people have better outcomes because they're able to plan for their futures better, because they feel safe, and not feeling safe in your home or in the place where you sleep is awful. So that's what happens on an individual level. On the bigger community level, decommodified housing, which social housing we're defining as something that's decommodified, has an impact on broader communities. So if you have one building, it probably isn't going to have that much impact. But if you decommodify a certain section of a city, what that means is that rents in other places start to go down as well, because the ability to speculate on housing in that market becomes more difficult. So you kind of have like an impact on, like, the people who are living in their homes feel more secure because they know their rent is not going to go up by $1,000. They're going to get kicked out. They're not afraid of evictions. But you also stop speculative investment in the market, or slow down speculative investment in the market as well. So there's kind of like two sides to the story.
Yeah, as we were thinking of that, you know, it kind of leads me to my question to Senator Chang, like specifically in your state. I know like the social housing is also meant to hopefully address some gentrification that is happening in Hawaii, and also I would say in Seattle for sure, and honestly across the country. What are you hoping social housing can do to address like displacement and gentrification?
So really top of mind question here in Hawaii right now, where due to the extreme housing shortage, Hawaii has now lost population for 5 straight years, one of the highest rates of population decline in the country, because people just can't afford to live here anymore. So a lot of them, you know, a lot of my friends now live in Washington State, or, you know, a lot of them live across the continental United States. And that is a really, you know, it's really insidious. I think there's a culture that's developed in Hawaii where a lot of folks take for granted that they're only going to be able to see their kids or their grandkids once or twice a year because they're living thousands of miles away. But there are really big systemic effects too. So for example, over half of the native Hawaiian population, the indigenous people of Hawaii, over half now live outside the state of Hawaii, driven in large part, I think, due to the cost of housing. So if we're able to create a large source of housing that is really inexpensive, and have people just take for granted the fact that they will find a low cost place to live, the way that we can take for granted, you know, public high school, or, you know, public highways or public parks, I think that would really do a lot to reverse this process, where not only will people not be forced to leave, but a lot of those folks will be able to return as well. You know, I believe that our communities should be mixed. And when you have these communities in action in Singapore, you have rich and poor living side by side. And I really think that is the way to go. And slicing and dicing the community based on income levels is, I think, really counterproductive in a political level. You know, a concrete example of that is here at the beginning of the pandemic, when Hawaii was experiencing the worst economic crisis in generations and the highest unemployment rate in the United States. We were talking about furloughing public school teachers by 20%, which is a really drastic, you know, 1 day a week furlough, because state tax revenues had really cratered. But nobody suggested that we limit public schools only to those families making under 140% of AMI. Right? We still had this universal belief that school should be for everybody. And in the same way, you know, I believe that housing should be for everybody, and that, you know, the way that public schools are places where, you know, a cross section of the community comes together. I believe that these neighborhoods would be cross sections where the community is able to come together. And we really see that in Singapore. In Singapore, they do have very stable communities in these leasehold units, the same in Vienna. And you could have, you know, the president of the country living side by side with a formerly homeless family.
Yeah, I think a lot of the things that you described, a lot of Seattleites and maybe people from California are also familiar with. So I think, yeah, I think they did a good job of addressing some issues that we're having across cities, even though you're specifically talking about your home state of Hawaii. I have one final question for the panelists before I answer some of the questions that we've got in today. And we probably touched on it, but this is kind of like a last minute plug for what are you doing regarding social housing. I know we probably said it a lot already, so if you want to keep it brief, great. But then we'll go into some of the directed questions that we've gotten from the audience tonight. And how about we start with Paul? What are you doing regarding social housing right now? And you should also mention your advisor.
Well, I'm helping house our neighbors, I think through some of the kind of technical questions and strategy stuff. And I'm really happy to be doing that. There's a number of other groups across the country that I've talked to, some of whom, you know, have pieces of legislation that they are introducing. There's a bill in California that would create a kind of new state agency to do something like this. And there's a lot of other groups that are really just getting started, wanting to create a campaign to do something like what you know, essentially like what House Our Neighbors is doing. You know, I've talked to folks in Colorado and Rhode Island and Washington, D.C. And I think, you know, a lot of the questions, you know, I think there's a lot of organizing momentum. A lot of people who experience the housing crisis as something very real in their lives and experience high rents and displacement pressures and all of these things. And there's a lot of energy to do something about it. And I think people are really, you know, want to figure out how we can kind of transform housing production in the United States, because I think it's you know, it's really easy to look at other countries where they have these public housing programs that have just been successful for the past 50, 60, 70 years. And I think people rightly look at that and say, why can't we do that? And so, you know, I think a lot of what I do is try and, you know, figure out and think through how we design institutions that can grow into some of these really successful programs that we see across the country. So, yeah.
Thank you, Paul. I'm sure, see and hear from you again. I appreciate that. And what about you, Oksana? What are you doing regarding social housing now, and how can people engage with your work?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm working on a follow-up report to a social housing report that we had come out about a year ago with a couple of co-authors that is going to outline 20 different policies and laws that could help us move towards social housing conversions in New York State. So that will be out like in late June, I think. So you should look it up if you're interested. And the other thing that I'm doing is working with a coalition here in New York City on a campaign to get good cause eviction protection passed. So this kind of gets back to the place where you started, Tye, where good cause eviction protection doesn't actually create like a social housing movement by any means. And it basically, all that it does is it helps people be able to have stability in their homes who are renters, because they're able to continue living in their homes after their lease is up. So you're guaranteed a lease renewal. But what that allows to happen is the ability for people to organize within their homes, and it builds tenant power. And that being kind of like the condition that allows people to fight for things that would allow social housing to get created, yeah, like I feel like it's important to make those connections, and I'm glad that you all in Seattle are making those connections too.
Yeah, thank you for that, Oksana. And what about you, Senator Chang?
So we've been working hard on social housing legislation here in the state of Hawaii since 2018. And I'm cautiously optimistic that this session, after 3 years of a lot of frustration, a lot of obstacles and setbacks, that we're going to move forward with some really important bills that will set the stage for our state housing developers, the Hawaii Housing Finance and Development Corporation and the Hawaii Public Housing Authority, to have greater leeway to create exactly this type of housing. The state is the largest landowner in urban Honolulu, especially around the rail stations that are currently under construction here. And there's a lot of opportunity for them to start building. There's really a few legal issues that need to be ironed out, but those are the things that I think that we can iron out this session. We also are fighting for additional funding for this to happen. While I think a lot of these housing construction can be basically revenue neutral, there is, often infrastructure and other costs that are better, borne. It wouldn't be a bad thing if they were publicly subsidized by the taxpayer. And I think that those are also on the table this year as Hawaii faces some record budget surpluses like many of the other states. I'll also say that it's just super exciting because even when I became the chair of the committee in 2018, 2019, this was not really a topic of discussion in the United States. The big movement at the time, and still to a large extent exists, was upzoning, was allowing more units to be built on existing single family lots. And that's what SB 9 was in California last year. The state of Oregon passed that a couple of years back. The city of Minneapolis did that. And I think because I think the conversation has now progressed to the next level. I think there is a realization out there in the community of which, I'm super honored and flattered that to be a part of this conversation that's happening in Seattle, that just allowing the private sector to do it is not and will never be a complete solution. And that's why we need to look to the public sector. And that's why even the state of California, with Assemblymember Alex Lee's social housing bill, is looking to do the exact same thing, to create a state housing authority to build a ton of housing. And again, it's the tried and true method that has actually worked in the real world. That's not just a theoretical possibility like some of these other proposals are. And so hopefully, Hawaii, California, Seattle will be at the forefront of this new movement. And 50 years from now, when people are like, oh yeah, everyone gets a low-cost home here in Seattle, could it possibly be different? We'll remember this moment as one of those moments where the history of this country really changed, and the prospects for the entire community, not just the very rich, just completely changed.
That actually leads me to one of the audience questions that I'm interested to go into, and I will direct that back at you, Senator Chang. You know, it's kind of the harder question, and it speaks to your like 50 years kind of comment on this being a longer term project. Someone's asking, while we develop the banks, groups, and legislation that we need for this vision, where will poor renters go? Seems like only public housing would accommodate us immediately.
Yeah, so that's a really important question, because I think there can be a lot of confusion and a lot of kind of, when issues are conflated, they can be very hard to untangle. So let me try to disentangle them. I strongly support programs and models like Housing First for those who truly cannot afford housing even at cost housing. So folks maybe at the 30% of AMI level, right? These are people who even like a few $100s a month is not going to be realistic to pay in terms of rent. And that's why in this country, you know, Housing First has been a best practice for decades now. I mean, ever since I was in the city council over 10 years ago, Housing First has been, you know, the model that's been pushed. But models like Housing First for the really, you know, the very lowest end of the income ladder should not, I don't think anyone wants models like Housing First to house more than a tiny fraction of the community, right? And so if we go up to that next rung, we're looking at, you know, the working class, the middle class. These are folks who are working people, bus drivers, school teachers, bartenders. These are not people who can afford a market rate home, but they can certainly afford a home in the hundreds of dollars a month. And that's where social housing comes in. Like I said, in Singapore, the median unit is a 3-bedroom unit that's being sold for $180,000. In Hawaii, we recently saw a study that showed that a unit could be built at cost and sold at cost for $400,000. With a existing federal 3% down payment programs, you could move in with just $12,000. And while I understand that's still a lot of money for a lot of people, $12,000 is now firmly within the realm of the working class, right? We're not talking about just professional people like doctors and lawyers. We're talking about people who are, you know, really not making a lot of money. And so I think that large middle class, working class population, and all the way up to the, you know, with no income restriction, I think that that's the population that can be best served by programs like social housing. And that by directing programs like LIHTC, like Section 8, like Housing First to the community that truly is the most vulnerable, that, you know, we'll offer a chance for the working class to be securely and well housed, and the resources that are directed at those who will never be able to pay, you know, or who are currently unable to pay even a few $100s, that they will have access to the needed housing that they need. So, you know, I think there are a couple of different strategies, and I think we need to be clear that we should always support both of them.
Thank you, Senator Chang, for mentioning that. I think in Seattle, like specifically, what we do see is folks that make that kind of like 50 to 80% AMI do take up a lot of the housing stock for people at a lower AMI, because we just don't have enough, period, right? We're not building enough for working class people. And so all of the housing that we have just gets like sucked up by folks who can afford it, even if that means that they're rent burdened as well. And so there is, Paul would like to say something on that. And then after that, I think I have another question that goes a little bit into that. So maybe you'll answer that, Paul.
Yeah, I just wanted to, you know, the kind of subsidy question comes up a lot. So I just wanted to talk about how we kind of solve it today, like very low income people, and how some other folks solve it. And I think what something that social housing opens the door for. So, today, as I was saying earlier, what we do for, we have essentially, two programs that exist for, very low income renters in the United States. We have low income housing tax credit, which, builds units that are available at, between 30 and 80% AMI roughly. And then we have vouchers, and there's still some Section 9 housing, but it's, very quickly dwindling and being converted to Section 8 housing. And we have vouchers, which are essentially a program that, a person has some income, whatever it may be. Maybe it's $0, maybe it's, a few $100s, and they pay a portion of their rent, and the voucher pays the rest of their rent for them. And I think that social housing programs that we want to develop in the United States, very much, we need to serve very low income people. We need access to those programs, and we need to expand those programs in order, one thing with the voucher program in the United States that's been a mess for a long time is that there are 20 million households in the United States that are eligible for vouchers, these assistance payments to help people pay their rent. There are only 4 million households that get them, right? The program is only 20% funded because Congress refuses to fund it, right? It knows that there's all these eligible people, and the way that it works is there's just kind of a line, right? And you get in line, and maybe, people wait 10 years in line to get a housing voucher. If we universally funded that program, that would make all of the kind of social housing work that we wanted to do all the much easier. And it would also help, these are the kind of additional things that we need to do to solve the housing crisis, right? And I think it's really easy to look at any one thing as the silver bullet that is going to solve every single problem that we have with the housing crisis. And I wish that were the case. It is not the case. Social housing is a very good thing. Public developers are a very good thing. Housing vouchers are a very good thing. Good cause protections are a very good thing. But none of them is going to solve every single issue at once. And so, the way I think about it is, we need every tool in the box. We need all hands on deck. And as, Senator Chang, I think, was saying, it's really exciting that, building public housing like this, public developers building social housing like this has really popped up the past few years as people have realized, like, wait, yeah, this is actually a really important tool that hasn't gotten enough attention, and we need to bring a lot of attention to it because it's a really important piece.
Thank you for adding that, especially as someone who's a former case manager. The housing voucher lottery system is deeply underfunded and tragically ineffective. I think in King County, between Seattle, King County Housing Authority, and Renton Housing Authority, we have one lottery every year, or every year, and it's for each three of the agencies, and they have about 2,500 to 3,500 vouchers, and they get about 20,000 to 30,000 applications. And as someone who's tried to get my clients into that kind of program, something in the housing world that's considered a golden ticket, I know exactly how impossible that is. And I think out of the year that I worked as a case manager, I think I got one person who was able to have that. So thank you for bringing up those specific issues with the current models, but also recognizing that we do need things like that. We just need to scale up all around. So I have a question. It's like a series of questions that I want to pose to Oksana. I'm mostly interested in the response to the last question, but just give me your thoughts. It's kind of a long one, but I do want to address it. Will social housing be able to serve as many low-income households as public housing? What's the future of those households? What about the deteriorating conditions we're dealing with in public housing now?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really good question. I think that there's kind of like a big federal problem, and then there's a local problem, right? And they're political and economic. So in order to build, to continue to build pressure, to get things like what you all are proposing in Seattle locally, like in order for it to happen, there needs to be like a groundswell of organizing and collecting signatures and all of that in order to create a new public development authority. But at the same time, like conditions in public housing, in the remaining Section 9 housing across the country is absolutely awful. I grew up in the NYCHA building in New York, and over the course of in the course of my lifetime, it's gone from being okay to being completely unlivable, just because it's been defunded by the federal government, by the city, and by the state through its kind of like lifespan. So I don't think that the two are necessarily in opposition. I think that building a constituency to fight for social housing doesn't have to be in opposition with building a constituency for fighting for additional funding for the legacy public housing that we have. I'm not super familiar with Seattle's market. I don't know if there's kind of like traditional Tower in the Park Section 9 housing left there and what condition it's in. But I do think that building both a tenant constituency, but also making sure that local elected officials are paying attention to what's happening could happen in tandem.
Thank you for that. We want to emphasize that, as we all keep saying, as many methods of getting housing affordable off the ground as possible, we support. There is a question for Senator Chang. I'm just doing time check, 7:06. It says, aloha Stanley, I lived in Hawaii for 10 years and I know that home ownership is difficult, but the rental market has seen a ton of foreign land grabbing, which leaves poor working families that are unable to purchase in shelters. How will social housing help the working families so often found in, it's a Wanai, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing this, camp sites that will never make enough to purchase?
Yeah, that's a great question. And aloha to you too, to a former Hawaii resident. So I think there are a couple of answers to that question. I think one is, so as a state senator in Hawaii, I make about $60,000 a year, which is less than 80% of the AMI here. I am eligible for LIHTC housing. So I can pay more than, a deeply subsidized program. So number one, it would help by removing people like me from the pool competing for this very small number of, winning lottery tickets. Number two, it would be affordable to a lot of families who are not currently able to, buy a home. So like I said, the median home price today on Oahu, the main island, is $1.15 million. So you would need a $200-something thousand down payment to move in with a traditional mortgage. And that is out of reach for the vast majority of Hawaii families. If you're offering a $400,000 unit with a $12,000 payment, suddenly, what I would never be able to afford a $200,000 down payment. It's just never going to happen. I'm never going to save for that. But could I, making $60,000 a year, save for a $12,000 down payment? I might not have that today, but that is a realistic goal. And that is something that I think, families can work toward. $400,000, like I said, is what a recent study found. A 2-bedroom condo unit could be built for here in Hawaii. That's affordable to, I think, 56% of the area median income, which is about $70,000. So if you imagine a family of 4, and let's say you have, 2 parents and 2 children, that would be each parent making about $35,000 a year, which is, firmly within the working class. So I'm not proposing luxury housing that is only affordable to the very rich. This is housing that is within reach of a lot of people. And then by doing so, the existing subsidy programs like the LIHTCs and Section 8s can be directed towards those who really do need it. There would be a really, I think both sectors would be served by this program as a result.
Thank you for that, Senator Chang. I think we have a few questions that kind of touch on Section 9, which I'm interested in talking about because I'm more familiar with Section 8 housing. So I think this is directed at Paul. So we've got the question of Section 9 housing authorities are not currently funded. How will this new social housing authority ensure they are funded? And then if you want to go into that, wouldn't we be in a stronger place as renters if we ensured Section 9/public housing gets funded over Section 8, which helps private landlords get richer? So maybe delving into those questions around Section 9 versus Section 8.
Sure. Yes, Section 9 is not funded, and it's a major problem. And it was really, really unfortunate. There was a lot of money that was proposed in the Build Back Better agenda that was moving through Congress last year that would have provided a huge amount of funding for Section 9, essentially to fund the capital backlog that's built up over the past 20 years of 25 years now of unfunding, and that didn't happen. So I think the difference between how Section 9 is funded and how a lot of people are talking about municipal and state social housing agencies is that the way Section 9 funding works from HUD is HUD essentially says, the tenants in your building pay this, I pay, 2/3 of their rent. And then I also give you money for, your capital repairs in your building. That's what HUD says to public housing authorities. So tenants pay a small amount and that's it. And everybody who lives in the building is very low income. And so, obviously, in order for HUD to keep making these payments to public housing authorities all over the country, Congress needs to keep passing laws saying, here's more money, HUD, here's more money, HUD. And obviously we had, a situation in the 80s and 90s where Congress decided they didn't want to do that anymore. What's different about these agencies that people are talking about proposing in cities and states is that you have this kind of mix of incomes in the building, and you have the public agencies who are not going to the federal government and saying, hey, I need money for my project. Buildings like this, you're not going to get low-income housing tax credits. You're not going to get Section 9 money. You're like, I can issue bonds and I can issue debt and I can build a project that can serve a range of incomes for people. And I can just make that work by myself, right? And then on top of that, say you're the city of Seattle, or, this is an example I like to talk about actually is San Francisco, where in San Francisco, they passed a ballot initiative that raised the real estate transfer tax in the city and is generating a lot of money that they want to use for social housing purposes. One way that could happen is if this state bill passes and the state can build these mixed income properties, the city of San Francisco can take that money it has and plug it into those buildings and say, I can lower the rents even more in this building, if I have these subsidies, if that's something the city of San Francisco wants to do. And I know that, Seattle also has grant programs. I know there was something, correct me if I'm wrong here, Tye. I know there was something in the past couple of years there, Seattle passed some money for housing. And, and I think, that's a plan that I think House Our Neighbors wants to do is, right, like we can do a lot of self-financing, and we can also apply for grants from the city and state because we want to, if we want to lower rents even more, we can go out and get that funding and do that. But that puts you in a very different position from Section 9, where essentially, you know, Ronald Reagan and Bill Clinton said, I don't like this program anymore. And that was it.
Okay, thank you, Paul. So it sounds like if someone is interested in, you know, lobbying the federal government to increase Section 9 funding, potentially they should find where Biden is staying in Seattle tonight and ask him about that. That sounds like an excellent question. And Oksana, you wanted to speak on this question.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, so I think that where we find ourselves in the US is like constant disappointment with what's happening on the federal level. And like every single time where I feel like I can't be disappointed anymore, like somehow it like sinks even lower, which is, yeah, like it's like a huge bummer. But I think that we could do a lot of stuff on the local level to advocate for both tenants' rights and for different types of social housing models. But I do think it's important to get back to a point that Paul made earlier, where in all countries where there's a functioning, like a big social housing sector that is often not one thing, there's different types of models. In order to get to the 0 to 30% AMI, so the lowest income people, including people who have no income at all, the only way to do that is if you provide like ongoing subsidy that stays around forever. So like we can't make the assumption that like, oh, this person is gonna like suddenly find a job and like, you know, like move on. That's like, that was the public housing. The idea, the initial idea of public housing was that people will, you know, like get on their feet, move out. We need to make the assumption that we need to pay rent for a lifetime for some people, which is fine. Like, I think that's like, as like a society, that is a goal that is completely acceptable and that we should be completely comfortable with. And we should also be completely comfortable with the fact that that's going to cost a lot of money. And that should be a priority. But the only way to do that is if the federal government is involved. So that's how Section 8, project-based Section 8 works, where there's a agreement between the private developer and the federal government that there's an ongoing rental subsidy contract. That's how Section 9 housing works. There's ongoing support in addition to the rent that the person is paying. And that's how things work in Vienna, in Germany, and in Singapore, that there's some amount of rental subsidy that's going into the equation as well. And I think that like, we should advocate for that. And that could look like Section 8 vouchers. There's problems with Section 8 vouchers, but like that could be it. It could be direct support to the Social Housing Development Authority or the public developer. But that needs to be kind of like in the equation as well. But in terms of how to get there, like I don't know. I feel like not super good about our efforts to do federal lobbying at this moment in time, but like perhaps other people feel better about it than I do.
Thank you, Oksana and Paul, for both speaking to that question of like just deep subsidies and how that's needed if we're expected to pay for folks who make 0 to 30 income, which, like you said, I think housing is a human right, but a city's revenue, to me, it doesn't seem like it'll ever be able to keep up, right? Like if cost of housing goes up and wages never go up, the people who are in that 0 to 30, how are we going to be able to sustain paying through that without some sort of federal government aid? So the last few questions, or a few questions that we're seeing here, have to do with basically barriers to social housing existing. And I want to speak directly to Senator Chang, because you're working on a policy right now. So you can, speak with some experience on how to convince folks and whatnot. So this says specifically for us, what is Seattle's biggest barrier to instituting these besides political will, like financial, legal, or otherwise? Actually, I want Paul to talk about that. Senator Chang, can you talk about what backlash, criticism do you expect to deal with in pushing a social housing initiative? And then I'll go to Paul for the next one.
Wait, who's going first? Oh,
yeah,
you are? Okay.
Senator Chang, please. I'm sorry for the confusion.
Yeah, so, it hasn't been an easy road. There have been a number of roadblocks that we've faced. I think probably the biggest roadblock in general, and I don't know how applicable this is in a place like Seattle, but whether you want to call it, NIMBYism, which is a term that a lot of people use, not in my backyard, or I prefer a more psychological term like place attachment. I think people have a very strong attachment to their physical surroundings. I think it is a very deep psychological phenomenon. I think if we're going to propose building, as something I've done, I've proposed building 200 towers, each 50 stories tall, at the site of the current Aloha Stadium in central Oahu. I think people are going to, the neighbors, especially of that community, are not going to like this idea of like a huge urban jungle popping up that might block their view or so on. And so that's why the proposal that I've written is many pages long. It's designed to counter many of the reasonable objections that people raise. Like, they don't want additional thousands of cars clogging up the already traffic, choked highways. And so these new developments would be built on transit stations that would rely primarily on walking and public transportation rather than adding any new cars to the highway. People don't think that the units should be available to wealthy overseas investors or Airbnbs or non-residents of other kinds. And so we can, require home owner occupancy, as well as ownership of no other real property. So if you buy this unit, you have no other real property. You are not an investor. You actually live here and you're a part of this community. This is your home. And we've tried to put all those safeguards together into this bill. As a result, it's a big clunky bill. And the reality is that people in the legislature don't like to read bills that are 30 or 40 pages long. And that's why we've had greater success with our shorter bills that just do little bits and pieces and allow the administrative agencies the leeway to do more, even though there may be fewer constraints upon them. And so, I fully anticipate that if and when the first large-scale projects get proposed by these agencies, those neighboring communities are going to flip out. And, I'm not sure how to address it other than to say that, well, I would rather fight one World War III in one community with 200 towers and actually move the needle and actually provide enough housing for everybody, versus fighting 100 different battles in 100 different communities, losing most of them, and ending up back at square one. I also think that it's possible with a public sector project like that to add in a lot of sweeteners to the deal to the surrounding community, like for example, being at the front of the line to get one of these units. Our initial proposals also would have clawed back 75% of the resale profit in every single resale transaction, so that these would never be attractive vehicles for speculation. There would be basically a 75% capital gains tax that would go back to the state to help maintain these units and keep these units in good condition for the residents who stay. I would be open to offering a 0% capital gains tax. Basically, you can flip the unit and keep all of the profit. And that would be a cash bribe worth potentially hundreds of thousands of dollars to these neighbors. Now, I don't know if that would actually make a difference. I don't know that anyone's tried offering large cash bribes to neighbors who are opposed to development in their backyards. But with a public sector developer, all these things are now on the table. And I think we would be able to be very innovative and creative at overcoming this type of opposition.
Thank you for that, Senator Chang. I think it would be hard for me to stomach cash bribes to the NIMBYs that we have out here in Seattle. They already own $8 million houses and they've got that waterfront view. I can't imagine what more they want from us. But I think that what you described is really answers that question and to the point. I had something I was going to say, but I will move on to the next question that I want Paula and or Oksana to answer. But we can start with Paul. What is Seattle's biggest barrier to instituting this besides political will, like the kinds of things that Senator Chang laid out, like, for example, financial, legal, or otherwise?
That's a great question. So obviously the political will for this is on House Our Neighbors to collect signatures and get it on the ballot and get everyone to vote for it, right? I mean, that's a nice thing about a ballot initiative, is that the political will here that you need is an expression of the voters. And, I think, and I'm hopeful that you'll be able to achieve that. Once an initiative passes, there's quite a lot of work that will be done in order to kind of implement and build up an institution like this and actually start building housing. And those are all of the financial and legal and really administrative things that I think are really important in these proposals. So I know, Senator Chang has been talking with the State Housing Finance Agency in Hawaii and the, other kind of state agencies that do, they don't build social housing today, right? But they do issue bonds and take out mortgages and, contribute, development activity to projects that are being built across the state, right? And in Seattle, there's agencies who do this, and there's agencies that do this in every city and state. And if we're creating a new agency, it is going to have to be staffed with people. And those people are presumably going to come from some of those existing city or state agencies who know how to do public housing or affordable housing development work, which is can be incredibly complicated. And there's not a massive, huge number of people who know how to underwrite a affordable housing deal or some who are just waiting for a job, right? And I really think that talking with people at these agencies and explaining to them and working through the issues with them and talking with them about how this model could work and why their support will be necessary and helpful. I think that's a really important next step, right? Because at the end of the day, somebody's going to have to be carrying out this work. And we want people who believe in it. And we want people to be kind of, to recognize that and understand, what the goals are. So, putting that team together, right? The team that's actually going to put these deals together and get projects built. I think that's a really big task. And I think that's, after passing an initiative, I think that's that will be a lot of work. I think that it very much can be done. I think that a lot of these people do, people who work at these agencies do care and probably will be excited to many of them will be excited to work on a project like this. But yeah, it's a hurdle and it needs to be crossed.
Thank you for that, Paul. I'm going to give the last same question to Oksana if you want to add to anything about what are some barriers that Seattle should look forward to about instituting this that has nothing to do with political will.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, kind of like building on what Paul just said, I think that the kind of like assuming, like this bill passes and there's a new agency, the knee-jerk like inertia thing that could happen is that it will just replicate the problems that already exist within the housing agencies that are already doing work in the city. So making sure that the kind of like radical potential that exists within the proposal actually transfers in and stays in is going to be like a pretty big fight. Because you're like, it's like no agency and no initiative exists in the vacuum. So ensuring that the kind of like the pieces about self-management and tenant control stay in is probably going to be a fight. And this kind of like goes back to the bigger financing problem, but like if the communities that get created are going to be truly integrated, ensuring that the 0 to 30% AMI population actually gets served is going to be difficult. And again, like for that, you need like an ongoing subsidy that probably has to come from the federal government. And that's a big political and organizing question.
Thank you for ending it on organizing, because I do want to do one last minute plug of House Our Neighbors. Thank you, Senator Chang, Paul, Oksana, for being here and answering those questions. I think that the biggest step for us, regardless of whether we win, though we definitely think we will win in November, is maintaining that movement, right? Like all the things that Oksana and Paul talked about, we know for a fact that once a bill gets passed, it is likely that government officials are going to make it kind of hard to actually implement it and the vision and the intention that we brought it to them with. And so, you know, this is much, much bigger than this one initiative. It is maintaining some, you know, renter power, and it's going to be like a long-term project. I'm super excited about it because I hate my rental situation, and I would love to have some kind of autonomy as someone who spends like $1,800 a month for this home. And so, you know, Tiffany just put the signature gathering link in there. There's a donating link in the chat if you want to check on that. But otherwise, I think that we're good. And I really appreciate hearing from all of the panelists and all of the questions that we got asked. Definitely look forward to other panels in the future. And you can reach out to us at any time at info@houseourneighbors.org for questions or to participate or get involved. But I definitely hope to see all of you in the future.
Thanks so much for having me.
This was great. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a real honor to be here today.
Okay, I'm going to stop the recording.